the morning the Great Bible came down from the chapel shelf at Quenner Abbey. Avis Tarwin was the only living soul who saw what fell out of it. She had been sent to dust the gallery, and dusting was not her work, and that was the first wrongness of the day. A lady's maid did not carry the long feather and the soft cloth from window to window. The under-house maid, though, had taken to her bed with a fever, and the house was short of hands, and so Avis climbed the chapel steps in the gray hour before the family rose, and she lifted the heavy book to wipe the leather beneath it. And a folded square of paper slid from between the gilt-edged leaves and dropped without a sound onto the cold stone floor. She did not pick it up at once. She stood very still, the cloth forgotten in her hand, and she looked at it the way a person looks at a thing that has decided all on its own to change the shape of a life. The paper was old. The fold of it had gone soft and furred at the creases. A line of faded ink showed along one edge, and a broken disc of red wax clung to the corner like a drop of dried blood. She knew, before she touched it, that it had been hidden. People did not keep their ordinary letters pressed inside the family Bible, behind the page where the births and the deaths of the House of Quenor were written in 3 generations of careful hands. What she did not yet know was that the woman who had hidden it was watching her from the chapel door. The Duchess of Quenor stood in the gray light with one hand against the frame, and her face had gone the color of the candle wax. And for the length of 3 breaths, neither woman moved. Avis had served in the house 11 months, and she had never once seen the Duchess afraid. The Duchess was a tall woman with iron-colored hair and a straight back, and a voice that could quiet a dinner of 30 guests with a single word. Now her Grace stood in her morning gown with her hair still in its plait, and she was looking at a folded paper on the chapel floor as though it were a coiled thing that might strike Avis bent. She lifted it. She held it out across the cold air, between them flat on her 2 palms the way one offers something to be taken. And she said nothing, because there was nothing a maid could say. Stay with me through the gray of this beginning. What looks like a cruelty here is a kindness withheld, and the kindness comes later, and it is worth the wait. The Duchess crossed the chapel. She did not snatch the paper. She took it slowly with 2 fingers, and she folded her hand around it. And she said in a voice that had lost all its iron that Avis would oblige her by forgetting she had ever seen it. Then she turned and went out, and her slippers made no sound on the stone, and the girl was left alone in the chapel with the Great Bible open to the page of names, and the smell of cold wax, and the certain knowledge that she had just been made to carry a secret she had not asked for and could not put down. To understand what that paper was, and why a duchess would hide it inside the holiest book in her house, it is necessary to go back. Not far, only to the spring before, when Avis first came to the abbey with 1 box of mended clothes and a character written in a dead woman's hand. She had not been born to service. Her father had been the curate of a small parish in the next county, a gentle, unworldly man who married late and buried his wife early, and raised his only daughter on Latin and needlework, and the conviction that a person's worth was a private matter between herself and her conscience. He had taught her to read 3 languages and to mend a torn hem so the join could not be found, and he had taught her that the second skill would feed her longer than the first. He had been right. When he died, there was the debt of his books and the debt of his physician and almost nothing else. And a clergyman's daughter of 23 with no fortune and no living relation had exactly 2 roads before her. One was the workhouse, the other was service. She chose service, and she chose it without weeping where anyone could see. And she came to the abbey as lady's maid to the Duchess, because the previous maid had died, and recommended her with the last strength in her hand. The house had decided what she was before she had unpacked her box. A maid who spoke like a gentlewoman, who held her spine like one, who could read the Latin on the gateposts and correct the steward's French without seeming to. The servants' hall did not know where to put her, and so it set her below the salt and above suspicion, and it watched her. To the upper servants she was a curiosity who would not last. To the housekeeper, Mrs. Dury, she was a girl who gave herself airs. The verdict that the house fixed to her in those first weeks followed her down every corridor. It was Mrs. Dury, who first spoke it aloud. They were in the still room, counting the linen, and Abbess had folded a tablecloth into thirds, where the housekeeper wanted it in halves, and Mrs. Dury had taken it out of her hands and said not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a woman stating a known thing, that the trouble with the new maid was that she had been raised to be a lady and would never make a proper servant, and a creature caught between the two stations was of no use to anyone, and a comfort to no one. She said it as one might remark that a knife was blunt. Then she gave the cloth back, folded in halves, and went on counting, and the girl folded the next one in halves and said nothing, because the woman was not wrong about the facts, only about what the facts were worth. The Duchess was a widow. Her husband, the late Duke, had been dead 2 years, and the abbey and the title and the great estate that ran along the river for 9 miles all waited, in the cold machinery of the law, for the next man who could prove his right to them. The Duke had left no son. He had left only his widow with a life interest in the house, and a will that pointed like a long finger toward his nearest male relation. That relation was Mr. Vinty, Berold Sangre, the late Duke's sister's son, and he had spent the 2 years of mourning making himself comfortable in the certainty that the abbey would be his the moment the legal dust had settled. Avis learned the shape of him slowly, as a maid learns the people above her from the angle of a back and the tone carried through a door. Mr. Sangre was a smiling man of 35, with soft hands and a tailor's eye, and he came to the abbey often, and he walked through its rooms with the proprietary slowness of a man pacing out a thing he means to own. He was unfailingly courteous to the Duchess, and unfailingly blind to everyone beneath her. He looked at the maid exactly twice in her first half-year, and both times it was the look a man gives a chair he is deciding whether to keep. He had a way of saying the word duty that made it sound like a debt the world owed him. He had begun that spring to speak of the entail as though the question were already closed, and of her grace as a tenant whose lease was running out. Into this house in the early summer came the Earl of Straththorne. He came on the business of the estate, for his lands marched alongside Quenner's along the eastern boundary, and there was an old dispute over a water meadow and a weir that 2 dukes had quarreled about and never settled. He was a tall man of 33, with a jaw like the edge of a cut stone, and eyes the color of rain on slate, and he rode up the long avenue on a gray horse, and dismounted without waiting for the groom, and the whole household understood within an hour that here was a different sort of man from the smiling air. Where Sangre filled the room with talk, the Earl emptied it with silence. He spoke little and watched much. He had buried a wife of his own 3 years before, the servants' hall said, and had not been seen to smile since, and he ran his estate with a cold exactness that made his tenants prosper, and kept everyone at the length of his arm. She met him by accident on the second day of his visit, in the long library where she had been sent to find a book of sermons the Duchess wanted. She had not expected anyone in the room so early. She was halfway up the rolling steps with one arm reached toward the high shelf when he came in, and she froze there, caught between the impropriety of being seen on the steps and the impossibility of climbing down without an unseemly scramble. He stopped. He looked at her, at the book in her reaching hand, at the spine she had chosen, and something moved very briefly behind his slate-gray eyes. He crossed the room and stood at the foot of the steps and held up his hand. Not to help her down, but to take the book so that she might descend with both hands free. It was a small thing. It was the sort of courtesy a gentleman extends to a lady, and never to a maid, and for one instant she did not know which she was, and neither, she thought, did he. She gave him the book. She came down the steps. He read the title on the spine, and then he looked at her, again longer this time, and he asked her, in a low-level voice, whether she had been reading it or only fetching it. She might have lied. A wiser servant would have lied. There was something in the plainness of the question, though, that did not allow it, and so she told him the truth, that she had read it twice and found the 3rd sermon dishonest, and she named the dishonesty precisely, and she watched his face the whole time, waiting for the cold to come down over it. The way it came down over a gentleman's face when a servant forgot her station. The cold did not come. Instead, his mouth changed at one corner, a movement so small it could be denied. And he handed her back the book and said only that the third sermon was indeed dishonest, and that he had thought himself the only person in 3 counties to have noticed. He bowed to her. He bowed, very slightly, as a man bows to a person and not to a function. Then he left the library, and she stood holding the sermons, with her heart going hard against her stays, and she told herself that she had imagined the bow, because the alternative was a thing she could not afford to believe. What she did not yet know was that the Earl had not slept that night, and had risen early on purpose, because the library at the Abbey was the only room in any house where his dead wife's absence did not follow him, and he had gone there expecting solitude and had found instead a maid on a ladder who read sermons and called them dishonest, and that he had walked back to his chamber and stood at the window a long while, troubled by something he had no intention of naming. The summer turned, and the Earl's business at the Abbey stretched longer than the water meadow alone could explain. He came to dinner. He stayed for the shooting. He found reasons to ride the boundary that brought him past the gates, and reasons to consult the Duchess on matters that an attorney could have settled in a letter, and the servants' hall began to talk, in the low, pleased way of people who have found a romance to watch, of the cold Earl and the widowed Duchess and the great alliance of 2 estates. That a marriage would make of Ice heard the talk, and folded it away with the linen. It was nothing to her whom the Earl married. She was a lady's maid, and her business was her Grace's hair, and her Grace's gowns, and her Grace's secret, which she carried still, and which she had never spoken of, not even to herself in the dark. The Earl, for all that he came so often to see the Duchess, did not look at the Duchess the way a man looks at a woman he means to court. The maid noticed it because noticing was her trade. She dressed her Grace's hair before every dinner the Earl attended, and she stood behind the high carved chair invisible, and she saw where the man's eyes went when he thought no one watched. They did not go to the head of the table. They went to the shadow behind the chair, to the servant who stood there with downcast eyes, and they stayed there half-second too long, and then they pulled away with the discipline of a man who has trained himself to want nothing. The first time she was certain, it frightened her more than the housekeeper's contempt had ever done. Contempt she could survive. Contempt was the weather she had learned to dress for. The slate-gray eyes that found her across a crowded room and held for the space of a held breath before letting go. Those threatened to unmake the only safety she had, which was the certainty of what she was and what she could never be. It was at the harvest dinner that the heir first marked it too, and being a man who understood the world entirely in terms of what could be taken and what could be lost, he understood at once that a thing he wanted was being threatened by a thing he had not troubled to count. He watched the Earl watch the maid. He watched it for the length of one course, smiling, and then he leaned toward the lady on his right, a thin, sharp woman named Lady Maris Bellamy, whom he had brought into the county and was steering, with great patience, toward an understanding with the Earl. And he said, in the carrying half-whisper of a man who means to be overheard, that it was a curious house indeed where a duchess kept a draggle-tailed parson's brat to do her hair and let her sit so far above her station that gentlemen forgot themselves. He said it pleasantly. He said it as a joke. And the words traveled down the table and reached the shadow behind the chair, where Avis stood with the wine waiting in her hand, and she did not let her face move, and she did not let the wine tremble, and she set it down at her Grace's elbow without a sound, and only her own heart knew what it had cost. Lady Bellamy laughed. The Earl did not. He set down his glass with a care that was its own kind of violence, and he looked at the air across the candle flames for one long moment, and then he turned and asked the Duchess in his level voice whether her household had always kept so fine a library, because he had found in it a reader of unusual discernment. Her Grace, who missed nothing, understood the whole of it in an instant, and she answered that she was fortunate in her people, and she let her gaze rest just for a breath on the still gray figure standing at her back. It was the nearest thing to protection that the maid station allowed her to receive, and she received it standing very still, and she was grateful. She was ashamed of being grateful, and the long dinner ground on. That night the Duchess sent the other servants away, and kept Avis to take down her hair, and in the quiet of the great bedchamber, with the fire low and the candles guttering, she spoke, for the first time, of the letter. She did not say what was in it. She said only that there were things a woman did to protect a person she loved, and that some of those things looked like cowardice from the outside, and felt like the only honesty available from within, and that the maid was not to trouble herself about a folded paper she had seen once and would never see again. She spoke to the looking-glass, not to the girl behind her, and her iron face in the candlelight had gone soft and old and frightened in a way no servant was ever meant to witness. Avis drew the brush through the long gray hair and said nothing, because she had learned in a hard school that the kindest thing a servant can offer is the pretense of not having understood, and yet she had understood. She had understood that her Grace was afraid of the smiling air, and that the fear and the hidden paper were the same fear, and that whatever was written on that soft-creased page was the thing that stood between him and everything he meant to take. The summer cooled into autumn, and the air grew bolder. He brought his attorney to the Abbey. He had the long gallery measured for new hangings. He had not yet the right to hang. He spoke openly now of the day her Grace would remove to the Dower House, which was small and damp, and stood at the wet end of the park, and he spoke of it with the gentle insistence of a man helping an old woman toward a chair she does not wish to sit in. And he watched the Earl, who still came, and whose eyes still traveled to the quiet servant at the head of the table, and the heir did not like what watching told him, and a man who does not like what he sees will sooner or later decide to change the view. He changed it, in the cruelest way available to a man of his sort, which is to say he did it through the law and through the appearance of perfect propriety. One gray morning in October, a chaise came up the avenue, and out of it stepped, not the heir but his attorney, and a second gentleman, a magistrate from the county town, and they were shown into the small parlor, and the Duchess was sent for, and the door was closed. Avis waited in the corridor with her Grace's shawl over her arm because the morning was cold, and her Grace felt the cold, and she heard through the door the low, even drone of legal voices. And then once the Duchess's voice raised in a single word she had never heard her Grace use. The matter, when it came out, was this. Mr. Sangre had grown impatient with waiting, and he had found a way to end the waiting. There was a question, his attorney said, regarding the late Duke's first marriage, an early marriage, brief and long ago and almost forgotten, to a woman who had died young and abroad. If that marriage had produced no living issue, the heir's path was clear. There had long been a rumor, though a servant's rumor, an old wives' rumor, that the first marriage had produced a child, a daughter, born abroad and never acknowledged, and that somewhere there existed a paper that proved it. A daughter could not inherit the dukedom. A proven first marriage and a living legitimate daughter, however, would shatter the late Duke's later arrangements like a dropped glass, and would tie the estate in chancery for a decade, and would cost the heir the one thing he could not buy, which was time. And so he had come, with a magistrate, to require that the Duchess swear before the law that no such paper and no such marriage and no such daughter had ever existed. She would not swear it. She sat in the small parlor with the magistrate's pen held out toward her, and she would not put her name to the lie, and she would not say why, and her refusal to every man in that room looked exactly like guilt. What none of them knew, and what the maid came to understand only slowly, listening at the edges of a house that had stopped troubling to lower its voice around a servant, was that the daughter in the rumor was real, and was living, and was a person the Duchess loved more than her own safety. The first wife had been her Grace's own younger sister. The child had been her niece, and the paper in the Bible was the marriage line and the record of the birth, the only proof on earth that a quiet, fatherless young woman, raised abroad and brought back to England under a borrowed name and placed, for her own protection, in obscurity, was the legitimate eldest child of the late Duke of Quenner. The Duchess had hidden it not to defraud anyone, but because the law that would acknowledge the girl would also drag her into a public war that would devour her youth and her peace, and very likely her good name. Her Grace had chosen obscurity for the girl over chancery. She had hidden the truth to keep a person safe, and now the hiding had become the thing that would damn her. Avis carried the shawl up to the bedchamber that night and found her Grace sitting in the cold with no fire lit, and she knelt and built the fire herself, which was not her work, and her Grace led her, which had never happened before, and the two women sat in the growing light of the flames without speaking. And it was then, kneeling on the hearthstone with the soot on her hands, that the maid understood the last piece of it, and the understanding went through her like cold water. Because the niece in the rumor the girl raised abroad and brought home under a borrowed name and placed in obscurity for her own protection was a girl of about 24, a clergyman's daughter by her borrowed name, raised on Latin and needlework, recommended into this very house by a dying woman who had used the last strength in her hand. She did not say it. The Duchess did not say it. Her Grace only looked at her across the firelight, and the look held everything, and Avis understood that she had been brought to Quenner not by chance, but by design. Brought close so that the one person in England who shared her blood could keep her in sight without ever endangering her by acknowledging her, and that the dying maid who recommended her had been the only other soul who knew, and had carried the secret to her grave to protect it. The Bible held the proof of who she truly was, and the smiling heir was 3 signatures away from making certain the world never learned it. This was the dark middle of it, and it grew darker before it turned. The magistrate balked of his oath, did the lawful thing and the ruinous thing. He directed that the house be searched, not by the heir who had no standing yet, but by the officers of the court, for any document touching the late Duke's first marriage, and the search was set for the following week, and word of it ran through the county within a day. The Duchess of Quenner, it was said, was concealing something. The Duchess of Quenner had refused her oath. The respectable thing, the unspoken thing, was that the old woman was hiding a fraud, and that poor patient Mr. Preyo. Sangre was being most cruelly used by a widow who could not bear to give up her great house, and the maid, who could have ended it, could not. To produce the paper was to acknowledge herself. To acknowledge herself was to step into exactly the public war her Grace had spent 24 years and her own peace to spare her from. It was to become, overnight, the disputed daughter of a dead duke, the prize in a chancery suit, the woman whose name would be argued in open court and whose every borrowed year would be picked apart by an attorney until nothing private was left of her. She had been raised to believe that her worth was a matter between herself and her conscience. Now, her conscience required her to choose between her own obscurity and an old woman's ruin, and there was no road through it that did not cost more than she had. She made her choice on the night before the search, alone with the soot still under her nails. She would not let the Duchess be ruined for protecting her, whatever it cost. She would not buy her own quiet with another woman's name. She rose before light, as she had on the morning the whole business began, and she went up to the chapel, and she took down the great Bible, and the folded paper was where her Grace had returned it, pressed once more between the page of names. Because there had been nowhere safer in the whole searched house than the place a desperate woman had already been found out using. She was standing in the gray light with the paper in her 2 hands exactly as she had stood 5 months before, when she heard a step on the chapel stair, and she turned, and it was not the Duchess. It was the Earl of Strathorn. He had ridden over at first light, before the household stirred, and he had been told the maid was in the chapel, and he had come up looking for her, and he stopped in the doorway with one hand against the frame, in the very place and the very posture her Grace had stood that first morning. And he looked at the paper in her 2 hands and at her face above it, and he did not ask her what it was. He asked her in his low, level voice whether she meant to save the Duchess with it or save herself. And the maid, who had spent her whole life learning to give the answer that kept her safe, looked at the man who had bowed to her in this room as though she were a person, and gave him the dangerous answer instead. She told him the truth. She told him all of it, standing in the cold chapel with the wax smell in the air, the first wife and the dead sister, the daughter raised abroad, the borrowed name, the recommendation written in a dying hand, the choice she had made in the night. She told him who she was, and she watched his face the whole time, waiting for the cold to come down, because a man might bow to a clever maid and still recoil from a duke's disputed daughter with a chancery suit hanging from her name like a millstone. The cold did not come. He crossed the chapel, slowly, and he did not take the paper, and he did not take her hands. He stood very close to her in the grey light, closer than a gentleman stands to a maid, closer than was wise, and he said her name, not the borrowed name. He said her true given name, the one she had told him not a minute before, the name no one in England had called her by since she was a child abroad, and he said it the way a man says a word he has decided to be responsible for, and it landed in the cold chapel like the first warm thing the room had ever held. Then he told her what he had not told her, in 5 months of silence. That he had known himself half in love with her since the morning on the library steps, and had forbidden it, because a man does not court his neighbor's maid, and had endured it through every dinner where the heir named her a draggle-tail and a servant got above herself and the cool blonde lady laughed. That her station had never been the obstacle he pretended. That the obstacle had been his own dead wife, whom he had loved and failed to save, and his certainty that a man who had failed once had no right to ask anyone to trust him with their safety again. He did not say it in a torrent. He said it in short level sentences, each one set down with care, the way he set down a glass, and each one cost him visibly, and that was how she knew they were true. This was not, in the end, a story in which a great gentleman appears and lifts the heroine out of her trouble by the simple magic of his rank, and even then, even with his nearness undoing her, she knew that it could not be. Mr. Deberin, call her. Sangré had not built his case on air. He had a magistrate, an attorney, a county half-convinced, and a court order for the search of the house. He had foreseen the paper. He had spent 2 patient years foreseeing it. The night before the magistrate first came, his attorney had let drop to a clerk, who repeated it to a groom, who repeated it in the servants' hall, that the heir had already prepared for the possibility that a paper might surface, and had taken care that any document the Duchess might produce would be challenged as a forgery. Got up by a desperate widow to keep her house. He had a man ready to swear the late Duke's first marriage had never been solemnized. He had built a wall around his lie, and the wall was the appearance of being the wronged party, and that wall would not fall because a maid produced a soft-creased page in a chapel. The Earl understood this faster than she did, because it was the world he had been born into, and she had only served. He told her plainly that the paper alone would hang her and free the heir, because Sangré would call it a forgery, and the county would believe him, and a disputed maid with a borrowed name had no standing to be believed against a smiling gentleman with an attorney. The paper needed a witness. The law could not dismiss. It needed someone who had seen the first marriage with their own eyes, or held the register it was copied from, or could speak to the truth of it from a place above suspicion. And here the Earl did the thing that made him, in the end, the man who deserved her. He did not offer to marry her quietly and carry her away from the trouble, which is what a smaller love would have done and what would have left the Duchess to her ruin. He told her instead that there was a witness, that the chaplain who had married the late Duke and her Grace's sister abroad, more than 25 years before, was an Englishman who had since come home and held a living not 40 miles from where they stood, an old clergyman whom the Earl had crossed in another matter and remembered, and that this man had kept, as such men keep, his own private record of every marriage his hand had ever joined. The paper in the Bible was the copy. The clergyman held the original and his word, and the register, in his own keeping. And he was a man no county magistrate would dare to call a forger. The heir, however, who had foreseen the paper, had very nearly foreseen the witness, too. The Earl had learned, only days before, that an inquiry had already been made to the old clergyman by a smooth gentleman from the county, asking after old records, offering to relieve him of the burden of his dusty register for a generous consideration, and that the old man, who was poor and proud and did not like the smooth gentleman's eyes, had refused, and had grown uneasy, and had spoken of removing the register to a safer place. Mr. Sangré was a week, perhaps less, from buying or frightening the only witness who could undo him. The wall was nearly finished. There was one gap left in it, and it would not be open long. They had 3 days until the search, and after the search her Grace's refusal would harden into proof in the public mind, and the old clergyman's nerve might break, and the gap would close. The maid did not go back to her dusting. The Duchess, when the whole of it was laid before her in the small parlor with the door shut and the Earl's standing grave by the fire, looked at the servant who was her sister's daughter, and at the man who loved her, and she gave at last the only thing she had left to give, which was permission. She had hidden the truth for 24 years to keep the girl safe. Now the girl had chosen to be unsafe for her sake, and her Grace would not insult that choice by standing in its way. She gave the copy from the Bible freely into the maid's own hand, and she sent the Earl's fastest horses to the old clergyman's parish with a letter in her own writing, requesting the favor of his testimony and the loan of his register, and she sat back in her chair, the iron gone out of her, and waited to learn whether the truth would arrive before the lie was sealed. It very nearly did not. The first messenger found the old clergyman gone from home, called away, no one knew where, and a strange gentleman had been asking for him in the village, not a day before, and for one night. It seemed the gap had closed, and the witness was lost. The old man, however, had not been bought, nor frightened into the heir's hands. He had instead done the thing a poor, proud, honest man does when he senses a wolf at his door. He had taken his register and walked, on foot, the 11 miles, to the only person he trusted with it, his married daughter in the next parish, and there the Earl's second rider found him on the 3rd morning, sitting at her kitchen table with the leather-bound book under his 2 hands, having decided on his own and for his own reasons, that he would not let an honest woman's marriage be unwritten by a smooth gentleman with a soft purse. He came back willingly. He brought the register, and he asked only that he be allowed to set the record straight in the place where the question had been raised, because a thing done quietly in a parlor could be undone, but a thing done in the open before the county's witnesses could not. So it was not in a parlor that it ended, Mr. Sangre, never doubting his ground, had let it be known that he would attend the search himself as the wronged heir, and had invited the county to understand that the Duchess's affairs were about to be set in order at last, and a number of the county's people, who had been told for 2 years that they would soon owe their courtesies to a new master at the Abbey, had arranged to be present that morning, to be among the first to pay them. They gathered in the great hall, the same hall where the maid had stood in the shadow behind a chair and heard herself named a draggle-tailed parson's brat. The magistrate came with his officers. The heir came smiling with his attorney at his shoulder and the cool blonde lady on his arm, and he greeted her Grace in the hall with the gentle pity of a man condoling with someone about to be exposed, and he said loud enough to Carrie that he had always feared it would come to this, that it grieved him to see a great lady so reduced as to be caught hiding a forgery to keep a roof she had no right to, and that he hoped the county would remember she was old and forgive her as he forgave her. It was the 3rd time the dismissive verdict had been spoken aloud, and it was the cruelest, because this time it was not a maid he meant to diminish, but the Duchess herself, and he did it in her own hall, before her own people, with his hat in his hand and pity on his face. The Duchess did not answer him. She turned instead to the shadow at the edge of the hall, and she said, in a voice that had found its iron again, that her Grace would have her maid speak. The girl came forward. The hall went very quiet. She was in her plain gray gown, with her plain white cap, and she held the soft creased paper in one hand, and she felt every eye in the county fix on her and begin, already, to dismiss her, a maid, a servant, a parson's brat presuming to speak in a duke's great hall. She did not raise her voice. She told them simply and in order, the same truth she had told the Earl in the chapel who she was, whose daughter, why hidden, why now revealed. And the hall did exactly what the heir had built it to do. It did not believe her. A murmur ran along it, of pity and scorn, and Mr. Tay. Sangre smiled wider, because a maid claiming to be a duke's daughter was the best thing that could have happened to his case, the very madness he had predicted, and his attorney was already drawing breath to call it a forgery and a fraud, and the desperate invention of a designing servant. He never got the word out. The Earl of Strathorn stepped forward into the silence, and he crossed the great hall, the whole length of it, past the magistrate and past the heir, and he came to a stop beside the maid in the grey gown, and he took her hand before the entire assembled county, and he turned to face them with her hand held openly in his. "I will marry her, and I stake my name on every word." It was 11 words. He did not argue the case. He did not abuse the heir. He did not make a speech. He stated in the same hall where the verdict had been rendered that he whose word no man in 3 counties had ever questioned set his whole name behind hers, and that he would make her his countess, and the staking of that name did in one sentence what an hour of argument could not have done. The murmur changed its color. A maid claiming to be a duke's daughter was a fraud. A maid whom the earl would marry, and for whom he would pledge his name in open court, was a different proposition entirely, and the county, which knew the worth of his word to the last farthing, felt the ground shift under its certainty. Then the doors at the end of the hall opened, and the earl's rider brought in the old clergyman, white-haired and plainly dressed, with a leather register under his arm, and the magistrate, who knew the old man and had dined at his table, came forward to greet him. And the witness who could not be dismissed laid his register open on the long table and showed in his own hand, dated more than 25 years before, the record of the marriage and the birth, and swore to it, and named the smooth gentleman who had come to his village offering to relieve him of it, and looked, while he named him, straight at the heir. The wall came down all at once, the way a wall does when the one stone holding it is drawn out. The attorney said nothing because there was nothing the law allowed him to say against a clergyman's sworn register. The cool blonde lady let go of the heir's arm and stepped very slightly away from him, the small precise movement of a woman who has just understood which way the wind has turned. And Mr. Blantwittrell, Sangre himself, who had been so smooth and so certain, fragmented in the way the confident always fragment when the floor goes out from under them. He began 3 sentences and finished none. He spoke of irregularities, of a closer examination, of his own grievous misuse, and his voice climbed and cracked, and the county that had assembled to watch a duchess exposed found itself watching, instead, a smiling man come apart, and it turned its face from him, not in cruelty, but in the simple withdrawal of regard, which is the only punishment a county ever truly metes out. And the heaviest it has, he was not destroyed. The maid would not have wished him destroyed, and the law did not destroy him. The estate was not his, and never had been, and that was loss enough. He left the abbey that same morning, and the chaise that carried him down the long avenue carried him out of the county and out of the story, a corrected man rather than a punished one, and the Duchess, who might have had him prosecuted for what he had tried with the old clergyman, did not, because she had got back the only thing she wanted, which was her sister's daughter, openly and at last, and she had no appetite left for revenge. The disputed estate did not pass to the maid, for the dukedom could descend only through the male line, and she had never wanted it. It passed, in the slow, lawful way, to a distant cousin in the north, who had wanted no part in the quarrel, and her grace kept her life interest in the abbey and her place at its head. And the long war that the heir had threatened never came, because there was nothing left to fight over once the truth was simply true. What Avis gained was not a dukedom. It was her name returned to her in the open, and an aunt who could at last call her by it, and a man who had crossed a great hall to take her hand before the county and had not let it go since. They were married in the spring, in the small chapel where the great Bible stood, and where a folded paper had once fallen onto the cold stone and changed the shape of 3 lives. It was not a grand wedding. The Earl did not want a grand wedding, and neither did she. The Duchess gave her away, and the old white-haired clergyman who had walked 11 miles to keep a marriage from being unwritten came back to join this one, and Mrs. Pallam. Jury, who had once folded a tablecloth out of the maid's hands and told her she would never make a proper servant, stood at the back of the chapel with the other servants, and wept, because she had been wrong about what the facts were worth, and she had the grace, in the end, to know it. On the morning after the wedding, before the house was awake, the new Countess of Strathorn walked up to the chapel one last time as a guest in the place she had served. She took down the great Bible gently, the way she had taken it down on the gray morning that began it all, and she opened it to the page of names, the births and the deaths of the house of Quenner in 3 generations of careful hands, and at the bottom, in fresh ink, in her aunt's own writing, her true name had been entered at last among them. The eldest daughter of the late Duke sat down in the family book where she belonged, and where no smooth gentleman with a soft purse could ever again pretend she had never been. She ran one finger along the line of it. She closed the book, and she set it back on its shelf in the gray morning light, no longer a thing that held a hidden truth, but a thing that held, plainly and forever, the simple fact of who she was. If this long climb out of the shadow behind a chair has stayed with you, sit with the last image of it a moment before you go. A maid carried a duchess's secret for the love of her and never once put it down to save herself, and in the end the secret turned out to be her own name, and the name turned out to be worth everything she had risked to keep it hidden and everything she risked to bring it into the light. The fire is warm in the abbey. This morning, the book is closed, and the woman who reads sermons and calls the dishonest ones dishonest has a name at last, written where it cannot be taken away, in the only hand that ever had the right to write it.